We're going to start. I'm going to do a history of public housing, mainly in Victoria, a little bit in the rest of Australia, but mainly Victoria. Because people, and I'm going to go way, way back, because most people don't actually have a well-rounded idea, thinking that the public housing struggle is something that is new, when ultimately it's not. It's an old struggle. We can close the doors if you like, it's an old struggle. So I'm going to do a little bit of historical meandering, which you may find interesting, or you may find it uninteresting. The presentation is videotaped. It goes on a YouTube channel, Joseph Toscano, naarm, where I look at radical history. Well, the first thing is, if we go back to 1835, the first European incursion and settlement in Victoria occurred at Portland with the Henty brothers in 1835, and a few months later, Batman and Faulkner arrived here on the good ship Free Enterprise. Now, a lot of people think that's when the dispossession began. Well, it didn't. When Hume and Hovell were crossing Victoria in the 1832-33, they noticed that many of the Aboriginal groups they came across were totally disorganised. Many people had smallpox scars. And you need to remember that colonisation is not just a matter of brute force, but disease is the main weapon that colonisers have used, not intentionally, but the fact they've got resistance to certain things which we take for granted, like measles, whooping cough, smallpox to a significant degree, while people who've never been exposed to it have no resistance. So by the time European colonisation began, many of the Aboriginal groups, especially those near the sea, the coast, had been decimated by disease. So they were in a particularly weakened state. And within 15 years, between 1835 and 1850, about an Aboriginal population was estimated at around 100,000, would have been much more before it had been destroyed by disease. It was actually down to 2,000 within 15 years of the colonisation process. What this meant is that squatters, and squatters aren't these nice little people who are homeless, who are trying to find a roof over their head. These were well endowed financially, sub-nobility mainly from England, who'd come to Australia to find their fortunes. And by 1850, the whole of what is described as Victoria was owned illegally by 700 squatters. 700. Now, the ascendancy of the aristocracy, or the squattocracy, was based on three things. One was genocide, the second was free land, and the third was cheap labour, from ticket of leave men and women convicts who served part of their sentence and were used as cheap labour. These are mainly people being brutalised by a system which was quite brutal. So by 1851, when the Victorian colony was established, we broke from New South Wales, we had about 50,000 Europeans in Victoria. Most of them are congregated in Melbourne, Geelong, and the majority of the land was being exploited by squatters to grow sheep, to grow wool, to send to the satanic mills during the Industrial Revolution. So this was a significant part of the process. Now, what people forget is that the gold rushes in 1854 changed things. Now, when the colony was established in 1851, a legislative council was established in the upper house, but that was dominated by the squatters. You needed to have access to so much land and so much money to be able to vote and to be able to stand for election. So that upper house was always on. The 1854 Eureka Rebellion did two things. One, it introduced universal male suffrage after the Eureka Stockade Revolt. But two, it introduced a period of disputes in the European community, which lasted up to the beginning of the 20th century. And this was about access to land. It was all about access to land because the squatters, by that time, had leasehold title, not freehold title, and 200,000 people who'd come to Victoria between about 1853 and 1855, once the gold petered out. And you've got to remember, panning for gold is a little bit like buying a Lotto ticket. Not everybody wins the big prize. So these people wanted access to land. So part of the Eureka Rebellion meant that when the first elections were held 3 years later in 1857, that the lower house was dominated by people who needed access to land for shelter, basically, and for, basic farming things. So you've got this situation, you've got this constant friction. Now, at the same time, this is the most radical period in Victorian, if not Australian history. Not the Eureka Rebellion itself, which was put down exceptionally quickly, but what happened afterwards, what happened after the Eureka Rebellion. What happened is there was this constant struggle for access to land to break the monopoly the squatters had on land. It worked within Parliament and extra-parliamentary. And what people need to understand is during the late 1850s and 1860s, there was a large radical movement and an alternative parliament was established with the southern markets where the old Southern Cross Hotel was, which was less than 100 metres from Parliament House, and it acted as an alternative parliament. And the difference was that it was based on a delegation system, not representation, but delegation. And don't forget, the upper house was still dominated by the squattocracy, and every time they tried to pass legislation to whittle away the land which they controlled, they blocked it in the upper house. So this went on for a number of years. In 1857, is one of the most important meetings, that's a 3-week meeting that occurred in this country's history that nobody talks about. I'll give you an example. I did some research on this about 15 years ago. It was the Victorian Land Convention. And what happened is communities around Victoria elected delegates to come to Melbourne, to the Golden Fleece Hotel, where else would you have a 3-week convention, to discuss the question of land ownership and what to do to break the squatters' stranglehold on land. And their slogan was, free land, free grass, I'm talking about the grass that animals eat, and a gun. Right? That was their platform. And they then had regular meetings at the Southern Cross markets in the Parliament. Now, in 1868, there's another thing you'll never hear very little about. There were huge riots in Melbourne. Every window in the Victorian Parliament House was broken. Thousands of people trooped into Parliament. The Premier at that time was assaulted. He had a table broken across his back. And what was the reason? The squatters who control the upper house wanted their leasehold title to be transferred into freehold title. When you've got freehold title, it means you can buy and sell that property. It's yours for all eternity and for your descendants eternity. So there was this big struggle to break down that monopoly. And it's not just about having a roof, it wasn't just about having a roof over your head, but having a mechanism by which people could survive outside the cities, because the industry wasn't that developed. Now, the next significant period would be the 1880s. Marvellous Melbourne. Melbourne and Ballarat were the richest cities in the world. They were flooded with gold. And if you walk around the inner city of Melbourne, you'll see all these Victorian buildings which were built in the 1880s. There's a lot of speculation went on, and by the early 1890s, what happened is there was starvation in Melbourne. The Melbourne Anarchist Club was very active in organising unemployed people. there were riots, there were food riots, there were people invading church services, demanding, because you've got to remember at this particular point in time, there's no social security benefits. So if you don't have access to work, you don't have access to food. And it was especially difficult for women during this period. And by the early 1890s, over 15% of Melbourne women were involved in the sex trade. Not because they wanted to be involved in the sex trade, but because it's the only way they could actually have a living. So what did the government do?
Legalise.
No. It did what every government does when it's under pressure. It opened up marginal land to the unemployed. And if you were unemployed, you were given 5 acres of land, as long as you lived on those 5 acres. And those 5 acres were allocated on French Island. And those of you who've been to French Island will know how marginal the land is. And if you look at the pictures of the kids, hundreds of kids were going to primary school in French Island during that period. And the Dandenong Ranges. These were areas where you couldn't grow sheep, you couldn't grow food. So if you're unemployed and you were destitute, you were given 5 acres. So what did people do? They left the city, took up the 5 acres, tried to make a living out of it. To me, that is public housing at its best. People are given freehold title to land because they can't survive in the city. And more importantly, they're causing problems in the city for people who have wealth and who exercise power. So what?
Selection Act earlier,
No, that was 1901.
I'll get to 1961, wasn't it?
Sorry?
1961 for Selection Act.
Yeah, but that was...
That broke up Scotland. It was the Grain Act, it was the Duffy Act, so...
Yeah,
I'm not cutting, so I'm just...
No, there's all these acts which I haven't gone through because they really didn't break the monopoly.
No, I didn't.
No, they didn't break, that's what I'm saying. They didn't break the monopoly. Yeah, they tried, but they didn't break the monopoly. Yeah, all right. And to give you a degree, remember the big riots in 1868 were because of the Duffy Act trying to... Yeah.
And you come out of place time Selection Acts.
Yeah. So we could go into the minutiae, but I'm just doing a wide cliff notes, 200-year history, all right? Because I'm looking at all these significant periods. Then you've got, after the 1880s, the 1890s, then you had what was called the Victorian Selection Act, the one that was in 1901.
Most recently.
Yeah, that was most recently. And that was designed to bring in overseas, mainly people from England, to begin farms. And if you go to places like Turadin, all those places down there, they were given away basically to migrants who came to farm, usually 50-acre blocks. And it was interesting, I was interviewing a woman, Angela, in Radical Australia 2 weeks ago, and her great-grandparents actually took that up and took up that selection. Now, that land wasn't too bad, but it wasn't enough for people to get rich. It was just enough for families to get on. So that's another mechanism of public land, giving away public land through the Selection Act. Then the next period was World War I. Now, during World War I, there were 5 million people living on the continent of Australia. An extraordinary number of men volunteered to fight in World War I. 420,000 from a population of 5 million. Now, the anti-conscription movement actually defeated conscription during 2 referendums in 1916 and 1917. That's 420,000 young men between 15 and about 40 volunteered to fight in World War I. 62,000 died on the European killing fields. Another 60,000 who came back died of their war wounds within a decade. So you've got all these unemployed, angry soldiers. So what do we have? The Soldier Settlement Act, where returned servicemen were given small parcels of useless, marginal land as a reward for their sacrifice. And most of the soldier settlements failed within a decade. Now, who's been to Kooyarrup? Well, a lovely place, Kooyarrup, full of asparagus. Kuwi-rup was the dividing line between the Kurnai and the Bunurong, who for thousands of years had been, saw this as the piece of land because it was marshes. So what were the returned soldiers given? Marshes.
Oh, no.
And it was their clearance of these marshes which has created the rich agricultural land, which has now been engulfed by suburbia in Kuwi-rup. So it wasn't land you could make a living from. All right? So that's another form of actually public housing. But interestingly, in 1912, the New South Wales government had an interesting idea. They created public housing for the first time in Australian history. And they created a community called Daceyville. And if you were poor, you could enter a lottery for a home. Right? And if you won the lottery, you could rent and then buy. So from around 1910, 1920, governments began to understand that in an urban area, they needed to intervene in the marketplace to provide housing for people. So the next significant issue was obviously the Depression. Now, Australia was particularly hard hit by the Depression, and around 25% of men were unemployed. And single men were not given SUSO unless they moved from town to town to town. But this created a lot of disturbances, and what the government eventually did at the state level is they created work camps where people could live in the work camp, they could obtain sustenance, the SUSO, and they could build great projects like the Great Ocean Road. So this kept a lot of unemployed, single, elderly men out of harm's way. At the same time, and there were huge or big anti-eviction movements, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, possibly even Adelaide, where we were seeing the growth of the Communist Party, which was established in 1921. So the growth of the Communist Party, a lot of people were attracted to the Communist Party, others were attracted to other types of radical movements, your anti-eviction movement, where if people were going to be evicted from rental premises or mortgages, people would turn up to stop the eviction, and if they were eviction, they'd turn up the next night and demolish the house. There are pictures of it. If you go on the net, you'll find pictures of things. In New South Wales, it got so difficult that the police were actually shooting at the anti-eviction protesters. Live bullets, and a number were killed. So you've got this movement pushing for the state providing access to housing. The next big step is World War II. Now, over 25,000 Australians died in World War II. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, were involved in the fighting. They returned home. There was no accommodation. You can look at pictures of returned servicemen and women living on the MCG turf and in the botanical gardens here in Melbourne. Sorry? Camp Hell. So there was this push to do something about this, and the Commonwealth government set up a Commonwealth Soldiers, I think it's called, housing scheme. So what happened is that returned servicemen and women, mainly servicemen, could have access to housing for a very cheap rate. And this somehow began the push for public housing in this country. Now, in Victoria, the push came to a head during the late 1950s and early 1960s with the slum clearance programs. For those of you who are paying $2 million for a little apartment in the CBD, and I'm sure all of you have got that money to pay your $2 million for your gentrified apartment. Obviously we all lived in the CBD. You live in the outer CBD.
See, you're getting the terms mixed up. CBD means downtown, central business district.
Yeah,
you're getting confused.
I've been facetious.
Inner city.
I've been facetious before. Being facetious, all right. Right. So you had these large slum clearance programs because if you looked at the centre of Melbourne and Sydney, a lot of these areas had been built up by slum landlords. Families were sharing rooms, paying exorbitant rents. So what do you do when you do a slum reclamation program? You've got to build public housing. And many of the towers that you see in the inner city were is a direct policy. Interestingly, at that particular point in time in the 60s, there were a number of radicals who had been elected to positions of authority. The mayor of Williamstown was a woman called Anne Fahey, who's still alive. Yeah, and they pushed, the Williamstown Council pushed for the development of those housing precincts in some of the best spots in Melbourne, with wonderful bay views. And their policy was, if it's good enough for those who can afford it, it's good enough for those who can't afford
It's
housing.
nicely placed and it's house swept, great views across the bay.
Isn't it fair to say, though, at that time the inner city was considered to be a slum? It wasn't a fashionable, desirable place to
Oh, it was
live.
a terrible place to live. It wasn't fashionable, it wasn't desirable. See, when the Whitlam Labor government came in, they actually gave money, direct grants to councils to do things like putting sewerage, putting light, putting footpaths, because the state governments just ignored these particular areas. So you've got the growth of public housing in Victoria, and by the mid-1970s, you had about 15% of Victorians living in public housing. But the next great step forward, using a Maoist term, leap forward, was actually the Cain-led Labor government here in Victoria, which did one of the most extraordinary things. It understood that putting people with similar issues in large buildings created problems. Created problems for the residents, created problems for the communities surrounding the residents, and it actually made the idea of public housing seem as if it was a not desirable option for people who were poor, who couldn't afford public housing. So what we saw is an extraordinary program called spot purchasing. And to me, this is the most innovative program that we've had with public housing. So what the government did, it purchased properties around the city, around the regions, allocated these properties to people who required housing. Now, what is the purpose of public housing? Public housing has a number of purposes. One, it provides obviously accommodation. Two, it provides security. That's what people don't talk about. The security of sending your children to the same sporting groups, the same parks, having the same friends. This is essential, if you're growing up. You don't want to be moving from house to house to house and moving from school to school to school. So it provides security. But in terms of having a diverse type of lifestyle, people who are living in these large estates had a similar lifestyle. So by placing families in spot purchased homes, which look like any other home, what happened is that neighbours, not in all cases, but the majority of cases, basically got used to the fact that this was a public facility. In many cases, I didn't even know it was a public facility. Now, I've got personal experience because I've been a doctor since 1975, and I've been looking after people with profound physical disabilities post-trauma. And that was before the NDIS, and unless you were covered by the Inadequate Workers' Compensation Scheme or the Transport Accident Commission, if you had sustained a severe injury causing a head injury, paraplegia or quadriplegia, physical trauma, you were basically stuffed. You had to rely on your family. The best you could do was get a disability support pension, and in those days it was called an invalid pension. But having spot purchased housing has made all the difference. And I still see families around this city, from Berwick to Dandenong, to Campbellfield, who've acquired access to spot purchased housing. and they've had children. They've been able to live on a disability support pension because it's 25% of their income. They've made good relationships with the people around them. Their kids have had a diverse lifestyle because obviously they may find themselves in a richer area or where they've got more options. And I've seen many children, I've seen them grow up over the years because I'm that old, that have left home, they've had a university education, they've had a trade, they've got their own home, and they're just ordinary citizens. And let's not forget that our beloved Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, this is important because people forget where they come from. He had 3 advantages which nobody has today. One, no, excuse me, can I finish? One, he had secure housing. 2, he had a mother who was a single mother who was supported by the state through a single parent's benefit, which was only introduced in 1973. The only way you could get a pension if you were a woman with children before 1973 was a widow's pension. That's all that was available. That's why there were so many adoptions. Right? So he had that. He had the advantage, and the third advantage is obviously through tertiary education. And it's quite sad that we've reached a situation where people don't even understand that the position they've reached in their life is totally dependent on the fact that they had their caregivers had access to public housing. So, but getting back to that, so I'm saying I find spot purchasing. I saw a family last week. They've got a spot purchased house in Little Park. They've lived there 40 years. He's a quadriplegic. His wife is, she's home duties and partial, not a permanent carer anymore because of MDIS. They've got a beautiful garden, dog, 2 kids.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, but they're selling all those places off. I mean,
I'm coming to that.
No.
We're coming to that. All right. I mean, I'm just talking about the history. I'm talking about
when was this purchase?
1980s. John Cain Jr. Yeah, that was it. Because they said, "What's the point of building more of these estates? We're going to get more problems." So we'll spot purchase.
I think you need both. You need spot purchase is fine, but you do need the projects. There's nothing wrong with the projects. I think there should be more of them.
Of course.
Well, I think that people should have options.
Yeah, that's
and
what
I think
I'm
a lot of
saying.
people with children would prefer to have a garden.
But I've got a lovely garden, people say.
Yeah.
And mine was a benefit of the Cain Kerner government in a different way because there was a walk-up estate, and I recently found one of the only few pictures of it, apart from in the homicide episodes on TV.
Right.
And it was like this taller than a regular 3-story. This is obviously why they put it down, because it was like 6 stories in Port Melbourne. Yeah. And what they built there was this beautiful townhouse estate with a block for older people as well. Yeah. And we have, a little front yard where people can park their cars if they want, and plus garden beds and the same out the back.
That's right. That's right. And you could sell it for $1 million.
Well, people bought them when they were 170,000 each. And somebody reminded me now they're going to have trouble because we know they've got their eyes on it, right?
Well, we'll get to that, right? So what I'm saying is, the idea that public housing is inferior housing is incorrect. It's totally incorrect. It's a myth which is created in the community. We create this community, public health, public education. It's just, it's not up to standard. So we now reached the period where Jeff Kennett government was elected, and we've got a dramatically changed viewpoint. What we saw was the beginning of the privatisation of public land. And you've all experienced this, you all know this, I'm not telling you anything new, but the sale of public land that occurred after the election of Jeff Kennett and then the Labor governments, after that he took on the same ideology, is extraordinary. It's a greater sale-off than we've seen since 1851, in my opinion.
Pulled down one of the South Kensington 12-storey towers. at the end of the 90s.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, we've now reached a situation where we get the Victorian Premier getting up and saying, "I'm pulling all the housing levers," right? And the word public housing is not mentioned. So why isn't it mentioned, and why isn't there much interest in the community at large? One, public housing tenants only make up about 3%. 3%, not 15, but 3%. Two, a lot of people still believe that public housing is substandard housing for people who, have got issues, whether it's drug issues, whether it's whatever, they've got issues. That's the thing in the community. And that's why in 2015 we created public housing everybody's business. Because if we want the public housing struggle to succeed, we need to be able not just to base it around public housing tenants who face eviction, who face privatisation, but we need to be able to convince the rest of the community that it's in their interests. Now, the problem is, and it's been very effective, there's been very effective propaganda, and people equate public housing, and even people who should know better equate public housing with community housing, social housing, affordable housing, inclusive housing. You name it, they call it. So there was this government initiative to blur the edges. Now we know that affordable housing, community housing, social housing, inclusive housing, whatever you like to call it, is basically private housing. And the difference is, it's the difference between having security, unless you do something really outrageous, you can't be evicted in public housing, or having a landlady or landlord who can evict you at any time and who can increase the rent at any time. And friends of mine, and a number of people I know, more like political colleagues, now in community housing and social housing find that nothing's ever fixed. The private groups that run it for a profit. They set limits on who can enter. They cherry pick tenants. It's not open to everybody, not based on needs. They separate them out.
You can build up the nice thing and have your private housing, but just make sure that you also include the
That's right.
other side. And then they make you have this separate entrance, you don't get access to it because it's
Well, that's right. It's like the first building that went up. I think it was about 15 years ago. Was in Ashburton, and that was classic. 90% private housing, and the 10% public housing was substandard at the back, no access to anything.
Yeah.
And that's
it's separating that. There's no way that it's not. You're not in the same community.
no.
Yeah.
So the thing is, look, we may think it's a good idea, but there's been a total ideological shift. So the type of people you see at public housing protests or public housing meetings are people like us. The usual suspects are not there. The large churches, the religious-based institutions, the private charities, they're not there because they have been incorporated into the private system by having titles given to them by the state government, by having loans, guarantees from the state government. So they're not going to open their mouths. It's like the Salvation Army, on the Commonwealth level running Centrelink, not Centrelink, CES, Commonwealth Employment Service, $8 billion industry for them. So we've now got these bureaucracies building up within these institutions. Some are not for profit, some are for profit. You've got these bureaucracies, self-serving bureaucracies, who've colonised the public housing debate. They've taken it over. They get up, they get the television time, they get the social media, they get the government contracts, and they say we are doing the right thing by people. And the thing is, I know a homeless person in the city where I want to identify. At one stage, he had 4 caseworkers. Couldn't find him a place. 4 caseworkers. Desperate situation. On the streets for 10 years. So, in my opinion, we've got to get out to the general community. Otherwise, we'll just be shunted aside. We'll be shunted aside. because we don't have that support anymore from the large religious institutions, from the charities, because they are on the other side now. They've been bought out. So I with public housing, with public housing, everybody's business. Well, we've done a few things, not a lot, but a few. And the governments are susceptible to pressure. In 2015, we were formed. In 2016, we held a 10-day vigil on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House. There were 30, 40 people camped on the steps 10 days before the state election. I stood against Martin Foley in the seat of Albert Park on a public housing platform because he was the Minister for Housing, right? Public housing, he was responsible. The government at that stage felt so much pressure that they promised to build 1,000 new public homes. That's on the record. On the record.
Excuse me, that was 2 elections ago, wasn't it?
2 elections ago, 2016. No, 2018, sorry, 2018, 2 elections ago. So that was Foley, yeah. They promised to build that, and obviously once they were re-elected, they just didn't do anything. But I'm saying they are susceptible to direct pressure. They're not susceptible to protests or public meetings or people chaining themselves and being arrested. They're not susceptible to that. But they are susceptible, in my opinion, to mass protests on the steps of Parliament. Now, we hold a little vigil once a week, but we're only a minuscule group. I mean, obviously when the Gaza situation maybe settles down, it probably won't, but if it does, there won't be as many people protesting there. And it's a possibility to actually have almost a permanent protest for public housing on the steps. Not because you're trying to influence people, but because you're trying to influence the politicians. Now, the Greens still have a pro-public housing policy in Victoria, unlike the Greens in other states, have a good public housing problem. They've got problems electorally, I think, at the minute, because of internal issues. But what I'm saying is that I think the way forward is mainly by having a visible presence. It's hard to organise, but it's easy to do. It's easy to do because they're not willing to, flush people off steps. They're not willing, and especially not 2 hours here, 2 hours there, but 24 hours, 7 days a week, just to annoy them. And they'll come out and they'll talk to you occasionally. So, how do we make people understand that public housing is in their interest? Because we've got to say, all right, public housing, this is simple. Even an idiot like me can work this out, and I'm sure everybody else has worked it out. We live in a capitalist society, private investment for private profit. You need competition in a capitalist society in order for prices to be reasonable. Okay, that's the whole purpose. We do know that if there's no competition, you form corporations and they basically set the terms financially, right? So in the housing sector, as the public housing sector shrinks, it's all in the private sector. Whether it's retail, whether it's community, social, affordable, inclusive, it's all in the private sector. So there is no competition. Because there is no competition in negative gearing, we find investors in the market, especially at the lower end of the market. And you've got to remember that about 70% of investors only own one home. They've been told by financial advisors, put your money in real estate, it will go up, right? So the story is very simple. If you increase, you don't give money to the private sector to build stuff, but if you increase the stock of public housing, what that means is there is less need for people to rent or buy at the lower end of the market, which is obviously exceptionally difficult. There's less reason to buy as the amount of competition increases, that public housing stock increases. What happens is that housing prices will drop at the lower end of the market, which means people's children and grandchildren can actually get a foothold in the housing market without actually having to ask for government support as they do now, and that government support usually pushes up things. So that's how. The second thing is, people talk about crime, and at the minute there is this thing that Melbourne is engulfed in crime, that people like you can't come to the Footscray Hotel and have a good beer without being bashed, right? That's what people believe in the northeast. But seriously, when you've got people in public housing and kids in a secure environment and families not having to move around all the time, you've got less chance of kids taking, a more violent position because they may feel more of society. I'm going to finish in a minute. I cried when I first saw this, and I'm an old man. I've been around for 74 years, and I've seen death every, for the last 50 years as a doctor, and suffering. But when I saw the Smiths family do advertisements asking people to sponsor Australian kids to go to public schools, the game is lost. That's extraordinary. Nobody actually thinks it's extraordinary. I thought it was just unbelievable in a country as rich as Australia that we need to do this. People talk about, kids killing other kids, kids bullying, kids doing this, kids doing that. Well, obviously, if you don't have housing security, you've got to remember that the number of renters has increased. You don't have that security, you're not going to have a positive childhood experiences in the story. If you don't have the security. I know kids that have moved 7 times in the last 8 years to 7 different schools.
The community services are set up based on communities, and then you're forced to move out of that community.
That's right.
Because of domestic violence or whatever.
Yeah.
Then you have to get linked into a different community service, and the whole thing starts.
And you may have to wait 12 months before you actually get access because there's not enough, and then you've moved again. And
if the whole system is built as if we're in communities, but then they've just destroyed the ability to live in communities.
Look, I've said enough, but I'm just saying, it's an extraordinarily difficult struggle because governments have taken, it's an ideological position they've taken. I think it's in Austria, 40% of people live in public housing. I think it's 25% in France. And you do it intergenerationally. You can leave it to your kids, It's as if you own it. You can leave it to your kids. I know a bloke here who moved back to France to look after his elderly mother so he could actually get the flat, which he died. Terrible thing to say, but that's what he went for, basically. But I'm just saying, it's just ludicrous. And if you've got no competition in the marketplace, housing prices and rents just go up and up and up. They just go up and up and up. And that's why public housing is wonderful. And people say, where's the money? Where's the money? Well, I think, and this is something, we've been promoting in public housing, everybody's business, $6 to $10 billion every year is raised in Victoria from stamp duty on the sale of homes. Depending on what the property market's like, it'll be 10 billion, I reckon, this year. Why shouldn't money, which is raised through a taxation system based on stamp duty, which you pay when you buy a home, be put aside to create public housing, whether through spot purchasing, whether redeveloping the towers, whether it's building new towers. You could house 100,000 Victorians every year in new public housing and supply jobs. 100,000 if that money was used. And when you think of the money that's going into digging these tunnels, it's just extraordinary.